for around $210 million, driven by the construction boom, a solid contributions from Higgins, which it bought last year, and a turnaround in its laminates business overseas. Air New Zealand also reports, but its numbers are expected to be almost half last year, falling to around $190 million. It's tougher for airlines now that fuel prices aren't at record lows, and there's tougher competition to fly the record numbers of visitors to New Zealand. Pay TV operator Sky Television also reports, and it warned in December, that the numbers wouldn't be pretty because of a fall in subscribers and higher costs. A profit of around $48 million is expected, although the real attention
won the thrilling rain-affected match by 4 wickets, reaching the victory target of 208 with 1 ball to spare. New Zealand made 207 for 7 after heavy rain forced a delay of more than 3 hours and reduced the match to 34 overs a side. Williamson says South Africa's strong start with the bat was impressive and laid the platform for their win.
They put on close to 100, I think, and when you do that, certainly chasing 200 on a tough surface as well, it was a very good platform for them to build from.
Kane Williamson. South Africa lead the 5-match series 1-0 with Game 2 in Christchurch on Wednesday. Meanwhile, the New Zealand women's cricketers beat Australia by 8 runs in the rain-affected second T20 in Geelong to level the 3-match series 1-1. Whitefern Anna Pedersen took a hat-trick in the final over as the hosts, chasing a Duckworth-Lewis revised victory total of 70 in 13 overs, finished on 61 for 9. The decider is in Adelaide on Wednesday. Australian rugby and the rugby world is mourning the death of former Wallabies lock Dan Vickerman. He was just 37 years old. Tributes have been flowing on social media after the ARU confirmed Vickerman died at his family home in Sydney on Saturday night. There were no suspicious circumstances. He leaves behind a wife and 2 young children. Olympic bronze medalist shot putter Tom Walsh broke his own New Zealand record but was beaten by American Olympic champion Ryan Krauser at yesterday evening's big shot in Christchurch. Walsh finished second with fellow New Zealander Jack O'Gill third. Tottenham are through to the quarter-finals of English football's FA Cup after crushing second-tier side Fulham 3-0 at Craven Cottage. Spurs will find out who they play in the quarter-finals when the draw is made after holders Manchester United finish their match with Blackburn Rovers, which United currently lead 2-1 in injury time. And wing Joe Burgess scored a hat-trick of tries as Super League winners Wigan beat National Rugby League champions Cronulla 26-6 to win a record 4th World Club Challenge in England. And that's the latest RNZ Sport.
I'm Catherine Ryan. On 9 to noon today, inter-school rivalry. Shirley Boys High School Principal John Lawrenson on the real cost of schools competing for students. The Republican judge from Cincinnati who says it's time to impeach President Donald Trump. Auckland restaurateur and seafood aficionado Jimmy Gerard, also known as Jimmy the Fish. Mexico on the Kapiti Coast, making avocado and lime ice blocks for the end of summer. And politics with Sue Bradford and Matthew Hooton. Join me on 9 to noon on RNZ National.
Funded through New Zealand On Air. The forecast from Met Service to midnight for the North Island. Scattered showers, some heavy with isolated thunderstorms for Taranaki, Taumarunui and Inland Whanganui, afternoon and evening. Nelson, Marlborough and Buller, fine spells and isolated showers mainly in the ranges. Westland and Fiordland getting cloudier, isolated showers. Canterbury, Otago and Southland, areas of morning cloud clearing and then fine. Chatham Islands, cloud at times. In the main centres, Auckland, fine at times with the chance of a morning shower, easterlies and 25. Tauranga, a few morning showers, fine spells increasing, light winds and 23. Hamilton, sunny breaks, could get a shower this morning, light winds and 25. Wellington, fine spells, chance of a shower in the north, light winds and 24. Christchurch and Dunedin, cloud breaking this morning, then fine, northeast winds, Christchurch 25 degrees and Dunedin has a high of 22. It's coming up to 7:10.
And you're listening to Morning Report. Well, the Port Hills fire was finally brought under control yesterday, but 150 firefighters will keep watch for flare-ups for at least a week. It's hot, dry weather forecast and crews from around the South Island are on call. We can talk now to Richard McNamara. He's the Principal Rural Fire Officer. Good morning.
Good morning, Sergeant.
What is the latest with the fire this morning as it stands?
Well, same thing. We won't be just sitting and monitoring it, though. We'll be back into it. We've got 150 crew, which is currently going through the briefing with them right now. And they'll be going out onto the fire ground once again, digging out those hotspots, hosing them down, creating fire breaks between the communities at risk and the fire itself. We've got it under control, but we're not going to lose it. That's our commitment to the community. We're not going to lose this fire, and we're going to make sure that it is completely under control before we downscale. We haven't downscaled any of our resource. We've lost a couple of aircraft that they other work to do, but we've still got a heavy fleet of around 15 aircraft on this fire.
What's your greatest concern this morning?
My greatest concern is that we get all our crews up onto that hill, working safely and getting them home again. The concern is probably in the next day or two when the weather changes and we're getting into more of a dry environment. a little bit of westerly, and that wind will be then hitting at right angles to where it's been knocking us all for the last 4 days, and so that's going to generate different fire behaviour to what the crews have been used to. So that's always a concern when you get wind changes and temperatures coming up, because that means relative humidity is coming down, and the fire then will kick up in places.
So do you think it's possible that it could yet flare up again?
It will in places, but where it's going to flare up won't be a danger to our communities. That's the work we've done. We can't possibly put every hot area out in this fire. It's just too big. It's 2,500 hectares. The only thing that's really going to extinguish the entire 2,500 hectares is about 50 to 100 mils of rain. But what the crews have been doing for the last week, and will continue to do for the next 2, is ensure it's extinguished around the edges, so we have a significant and strong fire break between the residual heat in this fire and the communities at risk.
Is this the most complex fire that you've ever seen?
Yeah, it ranks right up there. Particularly in New Zealand, it is definitely the most complex fire that New Zealand has seen, particularly in recent history in any regard. Its impact on the community has made this fire such a difficult beast. We're having to deal with loss of homes and unfortunately the loss of one of our own. And there's a lot of raw emotion out there that our crews are facing every day, but they're doing a really good job with that. Our crews can't be victims in this fire. They've got to be professional. They've got to do their job, and they've got to look out for the people that have been badly affected. And so they're doing both jobs there.
And what kind of toll is that taking on them as they do this day after day?
Well, it is a toll, and our briefings in the morning refer to that. Refer to the fact that it's highly complex in terms of its technical aspects, and that we as our management team are ensuring that we get all our people off the hill and home to their families.
Now, I'm sure you're aware of the reports that have been coming out about a professional crew that was stood down on Monday, and there was a house that was lost. Are you able to give us any sense of exactly what happened there? Who made that call to stand down that professional crew?
Well, I wasn't there at the time, but what I can say is that any of the technical details will be reviewed both internally and by external audit, and we look forward to that because we have to do that, ensure that we are constantly improving in our management techniques. Unfortunately, every file is different, but I personally know the 3 people who made that call up on the hill that night. They are vastly experienced firefighters, both urban and rural, and if I was going into a firefight in Canterbury on any day, those are the 3 people I'd want to have around me. So I implicitly trust their judgment, and it's very difficult for people on the outside to make calls on people who had to face what they faced. And as I said in a public meeting a couple of days ago, I, as an incident controller, will never put a life in front of bits of water. We can build homes, rebuild homes, we can rebuild infrastructure. We can't rebuild lives, and we can't rebuild families, and that is our number one priority. Life comes first every time.
Just listening to you answering that, though, what exactly do you mean by that homes can be rebuilt but lives can't? Are you saying that the lives of the firefighters would have been at risk, and that is why the decision was taken?
Yeah, I absolutely do say that, and that's a judgment call that every fire manager has to make at one time in his life. This time we had, as I said, we had 3 very experienced fire commanders up there from both urban and rural. They, in their view, made the correct decision, and I'd rather be on this podium talking to you, Susie, about that and the fact that we lost homes, rather than the fact that we lost crew. And if there's criticism in there, we will take that. We will take it. We will take it. We will learn from any technical mistakes. But I'll go to bed at night knowing that in that particular incident we didn't lose anybody. We got them home safe to their families.
appreciate your time this morning. Thank you for talking to us. Richard McNamara there, the Principal Rural Fire Officer. It's 7:16.
Well, some fire-affected residents have been told it will be 3 or 4 days before they're allowed back to their homes. The residents of Worsley's Road, Hoonhay Valley Road and Kennedy's Bush Road were allowed back into their homes briefly yesterday to gather possessions. They met with emergency authorities and the Mayor, Leanne Dalzell, who promised to provide hourly updates. But Rory Craig, Kennedy's Bush home since Wednesday, says the information he's getting is useless. He joins us now. Good morning.
Good morning, Todd.
We've heard about the difficulty of the firefighting. I guess you're dealing with the people between that and the homeowners. What is your main complaint? What's missing in what you're getting?
Specific information about our situation, particularly in Kennedy's Bush. If you go up there, I challenge the Mayor to actually drive. There is no obvious sign of fire. There is no activity happening on the ground to do anything about supposed hotspots.
So they're not telling you why you can't get back in your view? They're not telling us
why we can't get back in our homes. They've moved the cordon up the road on Saturday evening from to where the old houses finish and the new houses start, and they haven't told us why we can't go in. So the terrain is different than the terrain up Hoonhay Valley Road or Worsley's Road, where the obvious damage is there. You know, they talk about dangers of fire in the ground through big tree roots. There are no big trees up there. It's a scrub fire that's been stopped. If there are hotspots, they should be explaining to us the risk.
So what's your gut feeling? Do they not have the information, or is there a lack of leadership? Somebody saying, look, I'll tell you what's going on.
Yeah, there's a lack of leadership. And Leanne needs to stand up and talk to us and tell us why it is. If she goes up and has a look, she will come to the same conclusion if she just looks at the visual information available to her, that this is relatively benign compared to other areas of the fire. Now, the science may tell us that the visual evidence is incorrect. That's fine. Come and explain to us the science. Bring the scientists along to Hallswell Library today. Show us the graphs. Show us the thermal imaging. Show us the risk that we are facing, because we weren't given any of this information.
Rory Craig, thanks for joining us. Stay with us, though. Susie has the Mayor with her now, may be able to answer some of your queries. It's 7:19.
Absolutely. Leanne Dalzell, the Mayor of Christchurch, is with us now, and you were listening to both of those two previous interviews. What is your reaction to what Richard Craig was saying?
Well, I think that I take a comment. Well, first of all, I owe Mr. Cray an apology. It does appear that his information wasn't put onto the database, so he hasn't been receiving the emails. The information that he's asked for and people asked for at the meeting is on the website. The heat maps are going up. They're constantly being refreshed. And I just want to quote the lead pilot that was put out in the last update that we put out last night. People look at everything blackened with no smoke and they think it's all over. It's not. This is one of the most dangerous fires I've worked on in my 45 years of flying. And that really backs up what Richard said before, and that is that this is an incredibly complex fire. That doesn't take away from the fact that people like Mr. Cray want to know when they can go home. And they will be allowed to go home when the fire experts tell us that they can. So this is purely about safety, and I can't answer Mr. Cray's question personally. I'm not a fire expert. None of the civil defence controllers are fire experts. They have day jobs at the council. I think what has really come to light over the last few days is that people don't understand that civil defence isn't a standalone organisation. It's council staff, it's police, it's fire, it's health and welfare, all working collaboratively, taking on different areas of responsibility for the decisions that they are experts in.
But the situation here where, as Richard McNamara was saying, it was too dangerous to send some of the professional fire crews into some of the areas and they were being stood down. If that's the sort of information that you're getting...
Excuse me, you heard Richard, sorry, I've forgotten his surname.
Richard McNamara.
You heard Richard McNamara say that there would be a review of that. That is not something that you or I can comment on. And I actually think that it's irresponsible to comment on decisions that are made, and those decisions people will be held accountable
Well, but
for.
just hang on a minute, Mayor.
Communication, and I take full responsibility for the communication breakdowns. We should have registered every person who was evacuated straight away and confirmed their registration. We should have updated the website as a single source of truth every hour. We should have had regular small meetings rather than a big one on Saturday.
Okay, all right, but I do need to put this point to you though, Mr. Dalzell. I do need to put this point to you.
Say today is that he wants to hear from the experts. The experts are providing assessments, so we've got infrared cameras. I'm looking out the window, though.
Okay,
I don't know whether they're going to be able to...
Mayor, I do need to get this question to you, though. Richard McNamara did say in the final answer that he gave us that it was too dangerous, in some instances, to send the professional crews into some areas. It was going to be risking their lives. So I'm asking you, if that is the kind of information that you are getting as the Mayor of Christchurch, should, for example, a state of emergency have been declared earlier?
That is something that we will review later. All of the information that I have been given by the experts on the ground, people like Richard McNamara, all of the people have said to me not one bit of difference would have been made by calling a civil defence emergency earlier. But I've said I will be held accountable for that decision because it was my decision to make.
Okay, so the buck stops with you then, does it?
What Mr. Cray has asked for today is he wants to see these heat maps and he wants someone to explain to him why he can't go into his home. That is actually not an unreasonable request, and I'm going to pull out all stops to make sure that that happens for him and anyone else he wants to bring. But I can't make the arrangements at 7:15 in the morning from home. I'm going to ask people who can be brought together at what time and see whether we can get him to see that there is still significant danger in the ground.
But this communication problem, Mayor,
dangerous fires he's ever worked with in 45 years.
Yeah, and the communication problem, which has arisen again in Christchurch Council. Why is this still the situation? What, 6 years it is now after the quake when these sorts of concerns were first talked about?
Not good enough.
It's not good enough, but who is responsible? You're responsible?
I'm taking accountability for it as the Mayor of Christchurch.
Thank you very much for your time, Christchurch Mayor Leanne Dalzell on Morning Report. It's now 24 minutes past 7.
A former US senator once voted America's sexiest man and who later shocked the Democrat establishment by winning Ted Kennedy's Massachusetts seat is reportedly being lined up as Donald Trump's ambassador to New Zealand. Scott Brown lost his Senate seat to the high-profile Elizabeth Warren and was an early convert to the Trump presidential campaign. It's understood Mr Brown believes he will get the nod for Wellington. Jim O'Sullivan is a political reporter for the Boston Globe, which broke the story. He joins us now. Good morning.
Good to be with you.
There's been a lot of focus here, I guess, on the more colourful aspects of Scott Brown's life, his centrefold, his support for waterboarding and other allegations. Is too much focus being put on his colour rather than his suitability for the role, or is there a legitimate weighing up that needs to happen there?
I happened to see some of the local coverage, and I thought it was interesting. Scott Brown, in point of fact, is a fairly mainstream establishment conservative Republican. And in Massachusetts, which is among the most liberal states in the United States, mainstream Republican tends to be a little bit more liberal, a little bit to the left of the mainstream of the National Party. So he's sort of it would be too far to call him a liberal Republican, but he's certainly not a hard right conservative by any stretch.
So in your environment there, are people questioning whether he would be suitable for this role or not so much?
Sure, some question that. Scott Brown's a guy who had 35 years in the National Guard, so he's got some national security credentials. Obviously, New Zealand, a key ally of the United States, the Five Eyes, intelligence sharing. So I think there's some lack of appreciation for how prominent a post it is.
So it is considered a prominent post, but the news that he's being considered, is that likely to damage his chances of that turning out that way?
there's some concern. I talked to people in reporting this story, people close to Brown, think that it becoming public will damage his chances because I don't know if you had the opportunity to watch President Trump's press conference the other day, but it became readily apparent that he's not a big fan of leaks and that he likes to control or have the White House control, the administration control the flow of information. So this is certainly not something they wanted to get out. The White House gave us a no comment. People around Brown didn't necessarily want this to become public. So there is definitely some concern that the idea that it made it into the newspaper could harm his chances in the long term.
So from New Zealand's perspective, would it be wrong for people in New Zealand to think they would be shortchanged if they got Scott Brown as the ambassador?
I don't think so. He's a former U.S. senator. I know that much light was made of the fact that he was a centerfold at some point, but he's a former U.S. senator. I think he approaches policy seriously. And he is the subject of some amusement among Democrats here and even some Republicans. But a former U.S. senator, it's a fairly prominent role.
Jim O'Sullivan, thanks for joining us with those insights into Scott Brown. It's 27 minutes past 7.
And Australia's Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull has paid his first official call on his New Zealand counterpart Bill English. Trade and economic ties, also the refugee question, were on the agenda in Queenstown. Well, the two countries have vowed to revive the Trans-Pacific Partnership despite the United States pulling out last month. And during talks with Mr Turnbull, Mr English restated his offer to take 150 refugees currently languishing in Australia's offshore detention centres. Well, Mr English is with me now in the Wellington studio. You can also watch this interview on Facebook. Good morning.
Good morning, Sue.
Let's firstly talk about the possibility of Scott Brown as ambassador, as you were hearing there in that previous interview. Would you welcome his appointment?
Look, we will welcome the appointment made by the US government. It's their decision about who represents them, and I think, as you can see, there'll be a range of opinions about any candidate, as there has been in the past.
OK, but what would be the main mission with the American ambassador? Is this to carve out a trade deal?
Well, it's been the main mission has been to get the relationship between the US and New Zealand moving forward, and that's over the last 15 years or so. We've had a series of ambassadors who've, under both governments in here in New Zealand, have done a good job of that, and that's why the relationship's in good shape, and we would certainly want an ambassador who understood that. OK,
but pulling out of the TPP means that that's now something that you're going to have to look at again. That's something that was on the agenda with Malcolm Turnbull over the weekend. New Zealand to take a lead in reviving the TPP, which is currently a dead duck, I guess.
Well, we want to work with Australia because we've got similar views, which are that it would work for us, it would work for the region in terms of trade, and actually we want an ongoing way of keeping the US strategic interest in the Asia Pacific because it's a stabilising influence. So we're keen to show some confidence now in working with others, trying to build a coalition of countries who want TPP 11. They take some time to work out how to reorientate their own discussions, because a lot of them joined with the interest of the US being part of it.
But is there a problem though with Japan, which is going for its own trade deal with the United States? If Japan's not in it, how much of a sticking point is it?
Well, that's just one of the many possibilities. So Japan's the Prime Minister there has taken quite a strong view about trade compared to previous Japanese Prime Ministers. So our view is he'll be looking for opportunities and solutions. This is one that we would like them to consider. As for other
things that you were talking about with Malcolm Turnbull, the 150 refugees there, were you surprised that he is essentially saying that that's not something that he would want to do, to take up your offer to have them come here?
Well, look, I think the position's been the same for a few years. That is, they welcome the offer, but they haven't taken it up. They seem to have their own reasons for that. We didn't discuss that in great depth. Their main focus has been on this deal with the US, which remains in place and is being activated. So the offer remains. It doesn't look likely to me that they'll take it up in a hurry.
Okay. Why about the representations that I guess that you made to him over the New Zealanders that are detained on Christmas Island? Why were they not stronger representations for the citizens of this country?
Well, look, we represent the interests of our citizens, of course, as positively and assertively as we think is going to be effective. We've got these various processes going on with Australia regarding our citizens. So the people who are coming back, being sent back to New Zealand, essentially deported to New Zealand, as well as the rights of New Zealand citizens in Australia. And in each case, Malcolm Turnbull's taken a real interest in it. On the pathway to citizenship that opens up this year, there could be 70,000 Kiwis who can find their way to citizenship. And with respect to the returning people who've got criminal convictions, they've worked hard to make that a workable process. It's still, as I said to them, we disagree with the policy, but we do appreciate the way they've worked on the details to make it effective.
Specifically about those people who are at the moment being kept on Christmas Island indefinitely. You're saying you make these representations, but you don't think that they're going to be effective, that Australia effectively doesn't listen to you about how New Zealanders are locked up and the key essentially thrown away?
No, I don't agree they don't listen, but I think it's pretty obvious they don't always agree with what we say. What I would say is we've made progress based on goodwill. I mean, the Australian policy is their policy. They make it. It has strong political support in Australia, but we do have an Australian Prime Minister who has worked in steps to improve the situation.
Now, as for the fires, you're hearing there perhaps some of the coverage this morning about the Port Hills fires. Where, in your view, does the buck stop on the Port Hills fires and how it was that the crews were being pulled in and out, seemingly?
Well, look, there'll be time to go back and look at all the detail of that. I have some sympathy with the Mayor of Christchurch. They found themselves in an unprecedented situation for New Zealand, let alone for Christchurch. By and large, because of their experience, they're pretty capable with these decisions. But as Minister Brownlee has pointed out, maybe some of them could have been made better. Right now, though, the issue is a different issue, and that is hundreds of people who want to get back into their homes and trying to get a good communication about the ongoing danger. Just because people can't see the big flames doesn't mean that it's necessarily safe to go back.
Was it the right time for Minister Brownlee to raise some of the criticisms that he did last week?
Well, look, he's a minister who's pretty direct. You always know what Jerry thinks. So the issue's on the table, and it's one that's going to need to be dealt with, because the aim here is for people to have confidence in the system. And in civil defence, there's always a tension between centralised control and local knowledge, because the locals know what's going on, but it's easier to make decisions sitting in the middle.
But for the people in the thick of it, does that erode morale?
Well, look, I think it would if it was dysfunctional. There's bound to be some disagreements about decisions that were made under pressure. And we need to remember last Tuesday and Wednesday, things were very tense there with a very large, hot fire.
Well, that's why I'm wondering if you, at that stage, need someone like Jerry Brownlee making plain what he feels.
Well, he has, and we'll have time to consider whether the right set of decisions were made. But after each of these events, Christchurch earthquakes, Kaikoura earthquakes, these fires, we get the opportunity to do that. And by and large, our system has proven, even in this situation, to be effective at saving lives and saving property.
Just very briefly on the poll, the first one came out last night since you took over as Prime Minister. You must be pretty pleased with your debut, but I guess now is this that you spend the next few months courting Winston Peters and New Zealand First, and can you rule out Winston Peters for Deputy Prime Minister after September the 23rd?
We won't be spending the next few months courting Winston Peters. The job ahead is to meet the requirements New Zealanders have actually for winning an election. That's stable government and support for the stronger economy that is delivering them jobs and incomes. And they'll vote. Some of them will vote for Winston Peters. We'll deal with after the election. But we are focusing on the public of New Zealand, not Winston Peters.
So does that mean that he could be Deputy Prime Minister?
Well, look, the only thing we'd rule out is sharing the Prime Minister's job. And we're not going to get into a game over hypotheticals. The fact is, if we can aim to maintain the high levels of support we had in the last election, then Winston Peters wouldn't be part of the mix. But the point of all that is just stable government. And I think that the group of parties we have demonstrated that we can provide stable government.
Thank you very much for your time, Bill English, the Prime Minister in the Wellington studio. It's now 24 minutes to 8. We must get to the headlines and Nicola Wright.
The Fire Service's principal rural fire officer says lives may have been lost had firefighters in the Port Hills not been told to